Crash! The ground seemed to shudder beneath my tires as I pulled my beat-up pickup truck onto the familiar dirt road leading to my lake cabin. My heart was already singing at the thought of a weekend escape, crisp air, the gentle lap of lake, Serenity's waves, and the quiet of my little slice of paradise. But as I rounded the final bend, my stomach plummeted. Where the old wooden bridge to my cabin should have been, there was nothing. Just a gaping ravine, maybe 30 feet wide, staring back at me like a smug adversary. The bridge, my bridge, the rickety, weathered lifeline to my cabin was gone. In its place, a chaotic pile of splintered planks, twisted nails, and churned up dirt, like some giant had stomped through and left a mess for me to find. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a stop inches from the edge. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "What the actual hell?" I muttered, stepping out into the cool evening air. The scent of pine, usually so calming, did nothing to ease the panic rising in my chest. My flashlight from the glove box and scanned the wreckage. Beams that had held up for decades were snapped like toothpicks. The metal guardrails, rusted but sturdy, were crumpled like tinfoil. This wasn't a storm's doing. This wasn't an accident. Someone had bulldozed my bridge. My mind raced. That bridge wasn't just a way to my cabin, it was my sanctuary. My escape from the city's grind. I'd bought the place 2 years ago with every penny I'd scraped together, pouring my heart into fixing it up. It was where I fished for bass at dawn, where I sat on the porch with a beer, watching fireflies dance under a sky full of stars. And now, I was stranded on the wrong side of the ravine, my truck useless, my weekend ruined. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking with a mix of shock and fury, and dialed my neighbor Tom, who lived across the lake. The call barely connected before I blurted, "Tom, what happened to my bridge?" His voice came through low and heavy like he'd been dreading this call. "Jake, it was the HOA. They tore it down, said it was unsafe, and had a contractor bulldoze it this morning." The HOA. Those 3 letters hit like a punch to the gut. The Lake Serenity Homeowners Association, a self-appointed council of busybodies who seemed to live for petty power trips. Leading the charge was Karen, the HOA president, who'd made it her mission to nitpick every detail of my life since I moved in. My cabin's unapproved sage green paint? A violation? My gravel driveway? Apparently too rustic? Up at this? Destroying my bridge? This was a whole new level of insanity. I paced the edge of the ravine, my flashlight beam bouncing. Off the wreckage as Tom filled me in. The HOA hadn't even warned me. No letter, no vote, no courtesy call. They just rolled in with heavy machinery and obliterated the only way to my home. I kicked a loose rock into the ravine, watching it tumble into the darkness below. My blood was boiling, but as I stood there, staring at the ruins of my bridge, a cold realization settled in. That bridge wasn't just my lifeline. It was the only access to the lake for half a dozen other cabins, including Karen's pristine, overpriced lakefront mansion. The HOA didn't know it yet, but they just screwed themselves.
"I'll see that?"
Bridge sat on my land, a fact buried in the property deed my grandpa handed me when I bought the cabin. They'd destroyed my property, and in doing so, they'd cut off their own access to the lake. A slow grin spread across my face. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a war they didn't know they'd started. I was ready to fight.
Let's backtrack to understand the madness. 2 years ago, I bought my Lake Cabana rustic gym tucked among towering pines, with Lake Serenity's shimmering waters just a stone's throw from my porch. It was my escape from a desk job, a place to fish at dawn, sip coffee under starlit skies, and forget the world's chaos. The community was tiny, maybe 20 cabins, but it was under the iron grip of the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association, a group that ruled like they owned our every breath. And leading this petty empire was Karen, the HOA president, a woman whose thirst for control was practically legendary. Karen was a force of nature, and not the good kind. From the day I moved in, she targeted me like I'd personally offended her. My cabin's sage green paint, unapproved, she declared, hitting me with a $200 fine before I'd even unpacked. My gravel driveway, unsightly, per her sacred rulebook. I once got a violation notice for planting wildflowers. People, because they disrupted the community's cohesive aesthetic. Her letters, always typed in aggressive bold font, arrived weekly, each one more absurd than the last. I'd repaint my cabin, the same unapproved color, just to tweak her. But mostly, I kept my head down. Most neighbors did too, worn out by her endless crusades. Karen didn't just run the HOA, she was the HOA, wielding her clipboard like a warlord's sword. The community wasn't always like this. Tom, who'd lived there for decades, told me stories of a time when Lake Serenity was a laid-back haven. Neighbors swapped fish stories, shared beers, and fixed each other's docks. But when Karen moved in 5 years ago, things changed. She rallied a clique of loyalists, mostly wealthy weekenders, with fancy cabins, and turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom. Meetings became her stage, where she'd lecture us on property values and community standards while shutting down anyone who dared question her. She pushed through rules, banning everything from fire pits to colorful lawn chairs, claiming they'd make the lake less marketable. Most of us rolled our eyes, but fighting her was like wrestling a tornado, exhausting and pointless. The bridge fiasco was her magnum opus. Tom called me the day after the demolition, his voice heavy with exasperation. The HOA had been scheming to modernize the community for months, part of Karen's obsession with turning our quirky lake into a sterile, upscale retreat for rich outsiders. The old wooden bridge, a creaky but charming relic from the 1950s, was first on her hit list. I loved that Bridget groaned under my truck like an old friend, its weathered planks etched with decades of tire tracks and carved initials. I'd paid for inspections proving it was safe, with new supports and reinforced beams, but facts didn't matter to Karen. At the last HOA meeting, one I'd skipped because I'd rather scrub my toilet than listen to her, she branded it safety hazard and rallied her minions to act. Without a vote, a warning, or even a courtesy email, they hired a contractor and bulldozed it that morning. Tom said Karen watched the demolition like it was a victory parade, gloating about how the new bridge would elevate the community's prestige. The plan, a $50,000 concrete eyesore, complete with fancy lights and a tollbooth vibe. They sent me a bill for $10,000, my fair share for a bridge they destroyed without asking, on my land. I nearly framed that letter for its sheer audacity. See, when I bought the cabin, my grandpa handed me the deed, pointing out a critical detail. The bridge and its land were mine, a quirk from the original survey. The HOA never checked the records. They assumed they could steamroll me like they did everyone else. But here's the kicker. That bridge wasn't just my lifeline. It was the only access to 6 other cabins, including Karen's ostentatious lakefront mansion with its manicured lawn and tacky cherub fountain. Without it, they were cut off. No weekend escapes, no summer parties, nada. Karen's modernization had stranded her own clique, and she didn't even realize it. As I stood by the ravine, staring at the wreckage, I felt a spark of defiance. The HOA had crossed a line, and I was ready to make them regret it. I'm not a vengeful guy, but this was personal. The HOA had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let Karen's power trip slide. The morning after I found the wreckage, I woke up with a fire in my belly. I wasn't just going to fix this, I was going to make them regret ever touching my bridge. First, I needed to be sure of my ground. I hopped in my truck and drove to the county records office, a sleepy little building, where the clerk probably hadn't seen this much excitement since the 90s. I spent hours poring over yellowed maps and dusty deeds, my heart pounding as I confirmed what I'd suspected. The bridge and the land it sat on were mine, 100%. The original survey from when my grandpa owned the plot showed the ravine as part of my property, a detail the HOA clearly hadn't bothered to check. I clutched the deed like it was a winning lottery ticket. This was my ace. Next, I called my old college buddy, Sarah, a sharp as-attack lawyer who loved nothing more than sticking it to bullies like Karen. Over coffee at a diner near the lake, I laid out the situation. Sarah's eyes lit up as she scanned the deed. "Jake, they've handed you a golden ticket," she said, grinning. "Not only did they vandalize your property, but you can legally block access to the lake until they make this right. That bridge is the only way to those cabins, and you hold the keys." She explained I could demand the HOA rebuild the bridge to its original specs, cover all costs, and even throw in an apology for good measure. If they refused, I could keep the access closed indefinitely. The thought of Karen's smug face crumbling made my day. Armed with this, I got to work. I drove back to the ravine and hammered a private property, no trespassing sign into the ground, right where the bridge used to stand. The sign was bright orange, impossible to miss, with bold letters that screamed, "Back off." For extra flair, I parked my truck across the dirt path leading to the ravine. Its rusty bumper, a clear message. Nobody was crossing my land. I even tossed a few old tires around the sign for good measure, making it look like I meant business. By noon, my phone was buzzing with texts from neighbors, some curious, others annoyed. "Jake, what's with the sign? Can't get to my cabin?" I ignored them for now. This wasn't about them, it was about the HOA. By evening, the queen herself showed up. Karen pulled up in her shiny SUV, clipboard in hand, her face already redder than a summer sunset. She marched to the edge of the ravine, waving her arms, like a cartoon villain. "Jake, what is this nonsense?" she barked. "You're causing chaos. We need access to our homes." I leaned against my truck, arms crossed, and let a slow smirk spread across my face. "Karen, you should have thought of that before you bulldozed my bridge. This is my land, and I say, who crosses?" Her mouth opened, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. For the first time, Karen, the HOA dictator, was speechless. She sputtered something about community rights and stormed off, her SUV kicking up gravel. I couldn't help but laugh. Round one went to me, but I wasn't done. I called Tom and a few other neighbors I trusted, like old Mrs. Larson, who'd been at the lake forever and hated Karen's guts. I filled them in on my plan. I'd hold the line until the HOA met my terms. Tom was skeptical, warning me Karen wouldn't go down easy. "She's got half the board wrapped around her finger," he said. Mrs. Larson, though, cackled through the phone. "Give him hell, Jake. That bridge was fine before they meddled." Their support fueled me. I wasn't just fighting for my cabin, I was fighting for everyone who'd been steamrolled by Karen's HOA. The stage was set, and I was ready to turn their mistake into a lesson they'd never forget. The lake community erupted into chaos faster than a wildfire in a dry summer. My phone buzzed nonstop, neighbors flooding my inbox with calls and texts. Some were desperate, like poor old Mr. Jenkins, who just wanted to get to his cabin for his grandkids' annual fishing trip. Others were outright hostile, like Bob, a Karen loyalist, who left a voicemail calling me a selfish jerk for blocking the road. I felt a twinge of guilt for the innocents caught in the crossfire, but this wasn't about them. This was about teaching the HOA, Karen, especially, that you don't bulldoze someone's property and expect a smile. I stayed firm, my truck and sign standing like sentinels at the ravine's edge. The HOA's first move was laughably predictable. They called an emergency meeting at Karen's lakefront mansion, a gaudy eyesore with a cherub fountain that screamed trying to hard. Problem was, half the board couldn't get there without my bridge. Tom, who'd snuck across the lake in his canoe to eavesdrop, told me it was pure comedy. Karen, red-faced and pacing her deck, tried rallying her minions, only to realize her audience was missing. In a moment of desperation, she attempted to kayak across the lake to pick up her vice president, Linda. Karen, who'd once screamed at a kid for splashing her dock, was terrified of water. Tom said she wobbled in the kayak, clutching the paddle like it was a lifeline, and nearly capsized before giving up. I wish I'd recorded that. I laid out my terms through Sarah, rebuild the bridge exactly as it was wooden, weathered, charm, and OLAT, their expense, plus a public apology for their oversight. Karen's response, delivered via email, was a flat-out refusal. "You'll cave, Jake," she wrote. "The community's needs outweigh your tantrum." I laughed, forwarding the email to Sarah, who called it evidence of their delusion. They thought I'd fold under pressure. Big mistake. Days turned into weeks, and the standoff intensified. The HOA tried every trick in their playbook. First, they sent Bob and another board member to reason with me, offering to waive my $10,000 bridge fee if I'd cooperate. I pointed to my deed, photocopied and ready, and told them to get lost. Next, they got sneaky, hiring a contractor to carve a makeshift path through the woods, thinking they could bypass my land. I caught them red-handed, chainsaws buzzing at dawn. I marched out with my deed, called the sheriff, and watched as Deputy Harris, a no-nonsense guy who'd dealt with Karen's complaints before, escorted the crew off my property. The look on the contractor's face, pure confusion, was priceless. Karen's plan crumbled, and I added a second sign: trespassers will be prosecuted. The community was splitting at the seams. Tom and Mrs. Larson rallied a few neighbors. To my side, tired of Karen's reign, others, like Bob, doubled down, spreading rumors I was holding the lake hostage. Social media lit up. Someone started a free Lake Serenity hashtag, painting me as the villain. I stayed off the drama, focusing on my goal. Sarah kept me grounded, reminding me the law was on my side. When Karen's lawyer husband, Greg, sent a cease and desist letter claiming I was obstructing community rights, Sarah fired back, a masterpiece, detailing the HOA's vandalism and my legal rights to control my land. Greg's next letter was noticeably meager, asking for mediation. I declined. They'd learn the hard way. By month 2, the lake cabins sat empty, their docks gathering algae. Karen's mansion, usually buzzing with her fancy bar, was a ghost town. The HOA's budget was bleeding legal fees, failed contractor costs, and no new bridge in sight. Neighbors started questioning Karen's leadership, whispering about a recall vote. She was losing her grip, and I was just getting started. The standoff wasn't just about the bridge anymore, it was about breaking the HOA stranglehold on our community. I stood by the ravine, my truck still parked, and felt a quiet resolve. This was my land, my fight, and I wasn't backing down. 3 months into the standoff, the HOA's armor finally cracked. I got a call from Tom late one evening, his voice barely containing his glee. "Jake, they're folding." Karen's calling a meeting to negotiate. I leaned back in my chair, a grin spreading across my face. The HOA had burned through their budget on legal fees, failed workarounds, and bad PR, and the pressure from stranded neighbors was mounting. Karen's dream of a modernized Lake Serenity was in tatters, and her reign was crumbling. But I wasn't ready to let them off easy. They'd bulldozed my bridge, trashed my property, and tried to bully me into submission. This victory needed to sting. The meeting was set at the community center, the only neutral ground accessible without crossing my land. I walked in with Sarah by my side, my deed tucked in my jacket. Karen sat at the head of the table, but she looked like a shadow of her former self, hair frazzled, eyes sunken, her usual smugness replaced by a forced smile. The board, minus a few loyalists, avoided her gaze. Neighbors filled the room, some glaring at me, others nodding quietly. Mrs. Larson, in her usual front row seat, gave me a wink. The air was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. Karen opened with a scripted speech, her voice tight. "We've reviewed the situation and propose a compromise. We'll rebuild the bridge, but you'll contribute $5,000, and we'll waive further fees." I laughed out loud, cutting her off. "Karen, you destroyed my bridge on my land. You don't get to make demands." I slid the deed across the table, letting the room see it. "Here's the deal. You rebuild it exactly as it was wood. Same design, no concrete nonsense, pay every cent, and issue a public apology, or I keep the ravine closed. Forever." The room went silent. Karen's face twitched, but she had no cards left. I upped the ante, casually mentioning I'd had an offer from a developer willing to buy my land and build a private retreat, blocking lake access permanently. It was a bluff, but Sarah had coached me to sell it. The neighbors gasped. Even Bob, Karen's loudest cheerleader, looked pale. The HOA couldn't afford another legal battle, and the community was fed up. After a heated huddle, Karen returned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fine, we'll meet your terms." I made them sweat, pretending to mull it over, then nodded. "Get it in writing. I want the apology posted on the community board and read at the next meeting." Construction started within a week. I watched from my truck as workers laid the first planks, replicating the old bridge's weathered charm. 6 weeks later, it was done a sturdy, creaky beauty, just like before. I walked across it alone the first night, the familiar groan under my boots, bringing a lump to my throat. My cabin was mine again, but the real prize was still coming. The apology meeting was pure gold. Karen stood before the community, her hands gripping a crumpled paper. Her voice shook as she read, "The Lake Serenity HOA acknowledges our error. In removing the bridge without consulting Mr. Jake Thompson, the rightful owner, we regret any inconvenience and thank him for his patience." Every word sounded like it physically pained her. I recorded it on my phone, zooming in on her clenched jaw. Mrs. Larson clapped loudly when Karen finished, sparking a ripple of laughter. Karen slunk away, her clique silent for once. The fallout was swift. The HOA's budget was gutted legal fees, construction costs, and scrapped modernization plans left them scrambling. Neighbors, emboldened by Karen's defeat, called for a board overhaul. Within weeks, Karen resigned as president, citing personal reasons. Rumor has it, she's selling her mansion, unable to face the community's whispers. Tom and Mrs. Larson led a new board, promising fewer rules and more neighborly vibes. The lake felt alive again. Kids splashed at docks, barbecues fired up, and nobody missed Karen's clipboard. I'm back at my cabin now, fishing rod in hand, stars twinkling above. The bridge stands strong, a quiet reminder of what happens when you stand your ground. I didn't just win a fight, I reclaimed our community from a petty tyrant. The moral, know your rights, don't back down, and never let an HOA bulldoze your bridge, especially when it's your land. If you loved this epic takedown, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more stories of sticking it to the man. Got your own HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments. I'm reading everyone. Let's keep the fight against petty tyrants going.